Good evening, everyone. I'm Governor John Carney. Thank you for joining us once again for our Juneteenth History Forum, African American history here in Delaware. We have an expert panel that joined us last year. They're back again for the second year in a row. I'd like to introduce those first. Dr. Donna Patterson, who's a professor of history, philosophy, and political science at Delaware State University. Dr. Patterson is going to give us a kind of a fuller, deeper history of Juneteenth and circumstances around that historical event. We also have the famous Dr. Reba Hollingsworth, who's the vice chair of the Delaware Heritage Commission, a real prized Delawarean, and we're delighted to have her with us today and the expertise that she brings to the table. And we also have Syl Wolford, who's been talking about Delaware history, Black history for a long time, history and genealogy. We appreciate Syl joining us once again this year. This is a forum that we intend to have each year and additional forums, and I want to thank the Delaware Heritage Commission, Dick Carter, the chair, and Dr. Hollingsworth, co-chair, and the other members for helping us put this on and to help to communicate Delaware history, particularly the history of Delawareans of African descent, which so many of us know so little about. I'll speak for myself, and growing up as I did in Claymont, Delaware, I didn't learn much at all about the history of Delawareans of African descent, either in parochial school at Holy Rosary at St. Mark's High School. My first Black history course was at Dartmouth College, and I learned a considerable amount there from Dr. Nelson, who was a wonderful teacher. But my guess is the experience of most Delawareans, of all colors, frankly, because we attend the similar schools or don't get that grounding in African American Black history. And to address that problem, we just had legislation passed the General Assembly, HB 198, sponsored by Representative Dorsey Walker, which we will sign on this Saturday, which will require Delaware Public Schools to teach Black history curriculum, and includes a number of items which ought to be taught by those schools. I'd also like to I want to sign the executive order designating Friday of this week as a state holiday in recognition of Juneteenth, and hope all Delawareans celebrate the holiday by learning more about the history of our state, a deeper history which includes the history of Delawareans of African descent. I will recommend two books, both of which I've read. The first one is a book on Juneteenth. It's called On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon Reed, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning historian and author. She won the Pulitzer Prize for her book about the hemmings of Monticello, An American Family. And it was a real bombshell when that book was published several years ago. And then this book, which was published recently, Delaware During the Civil War, really gives a very good kind of superficial history, but history of Delaware during that period of time from the run up to the election of 1860, President Lincoln, through the Civil War time, Delaware as a border state, very much relevant to the context of Juneteenth and the Emancipation Proclamation, which did not apply to Delaware because it was a Union state, although a border state, which had many residents who fought both for the Union and many residents who fought for the Confederate States, mostly northern and broken down by North and South. I do have this executive order number 50 that I'd like to read part of the whereas clauses, because it does set out the historical facts that Dr. Patterson's going to expand on. And it is Executive Order number 50, whereas President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863, declaring that all persons held as slaves in states and parts of states in rebellion against the United States shall be free. And whereas on June 19th, 1865, so 2 years later, 2.5 years later, after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, Union soldiers led by Major General Gordon Granger entered Galveston, Texas, where African Americans remained enslaved, and proclaimed that the Civil War had ended and that the enslaved there were free. And whereas Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day, commemorates the emancipation of African Americans enslaved in the rebellion states. And whereas Juneteenth celebrates African American freedom, heritage, and resiliency, whereas Juneteenth offers all of us an opportunity to encourage continuous self-development, open dialogue, and respect for all cultures. And whereas Juneteenth, importantly, is a time to reflect on the recent events involving the tragic loss of Black lives and persistent racial inequalities in our society. And whereas Juneteenth will be celebrated across the nation on June the 19th, 2021. And whereas I wish to close state offices in honor of Juneteenth to provide state of Delaware employees additional time to reflect on our common humanity and mutual respect. Now, therefore, I, John Corney, Governor, do here, by virtue of the authority vested in me as Governor, do hereby declare an order June 18th, 2021 as a legal holiday pursuant to the merit rules of the state of Delaware. And now I've signed that executive order. And with that, I want to thank once again our panelists for joining us. I look forward to a very interesting conversation tonight, as we did last year. And I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Patterson to kick us off. And thank you once again for being with us tonight and for what you do for our students at Delaware State University.
Thank you, Governor, and thank you to the Delaware Heritage Commission for inviting me this evening. So I will talk a bit about the history, my experience growing up in Texas with Juneteenth, and then my fellow co-panelists will really fill in the holes about Delaware and what that means to this state. So Juneteenth, the origin of Juneteenth is June 19, 1865 in Galveston, Texas. For many, it marks the end of slavery. As the governor said in his executive order, some of the slaves in this country were free in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation, and many of them were also free in 1865 in a number of ways. With the end of the Civil War in April 1865, some slaves were freed. Slaves who technically had been freed in other parts of Texas were freed, but the troops did not make their way to Galveston, Texas until June 19, 1865. A bit about Galveston. Galveston is an island. It's an island. It's about, I'd say, 50, 60 miles from Houston, Texas. It's both an island and it's a city. So it's a place that's somewhat isolated. So in terms of troops and access, but also in terms of information getting to Galveston, if you will. And so there are a number of theories about why people who were enslaved on the island hadn't been freed earlier. Some of it is location, I'd argue, but in other cases, it was about labor, and it was about maintaining the labor of the slaves, the people who were enslaved on that island at that time. And so again, Juneteenth is the day that ends slavery in Galveston. Later that year, with the 13th Amendment in December 1865, there would be other people who were enslaved who would be freed. And so this also ended slavery for more people in the country. There were some states that did not ratify the 13th Amendment at that time, and there'll be lots more discussion about that. But ultimately, most of the slaves, most of the people who were enslaved in this country were freed between 1863 and 1865. Now, Juneteenth, as a holiday, has been a state holiday in Texas since 1980. And it's a very celebratory holiday. People come, they gather often in parks, sometimes inside venues, but often outside venues. There are cookouts, there's music, there's a lot of camaraderie. There are sometimes different performances, and you may see people that you have not seen for the rest of the year. Sometimes relatives come in from out of town, and that's a lot of how Juneteenth looks in Texas. And so it's been celebrated basically in Texas since 1867, and it's gone through these reiterations. Sometimes it's not celebrated as widely, but definitely in the last decades, it's been celebrated very widely in the state. And what we've also been seeing in recent decades is really seeing Juneteenth spread throughout this country with celebrations throughout. Here in Delaware, Salisbury has a big celebration, all around the DMV. Philadelphia has a lot of celebrations, but there are celebrations all over the country. A lot of the pockets are in the South, the Midwest, and also as we see parts of, the East Coast corridor, if you will. And so for me, as someone who grew up as a Black Texan who had been participating in Juneteenth for my entire life, it's something that I try to honor every year. Now, when I'm a professor and not a chair of my department, I have Juneteenth off. But as the chair, I work 12 months, for instance. So what I've done since I've been chair is I take Juneteenth off. I take it off and honor it as a personal holiday. Thankfully, for the last 2 years, Dr. Allen has actually made it a university holiday. So I don't have to take my own day off. And he gives the university the day off. So we did it last year, this year, and he says it will be a permanent holiday. Excuse me. So that's been really good to see, Del State integrated, to see the governor integrated, give government employees a day off in the state, and look at how it's kind of morphed and come and started to move into something else, if you will, in this country. I'd be remiss not to mention that many of you probably know that yesterday the Senate actually voted to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. And so now it goes to the House, and then it'll move on from there. But it appears that it probably will be a federal holiday. I don't know if it's going to happen by Saturday, but I'd say very likely by next year. And so this is what Juneteenth looks like to me, from someone who grew up in Texas and someone who teaches history. And so those are the main takeaways.
So if I may, going back to the book that I referenced earlier on by Annette Gordon-Reed, one of the things that was amazing to me about the book was not so much the historical facts, but really the context, the subtext of relationships among groups of people in Texas. She too is a Texas native, as you probably know. I could tell by your smile and shaking your head. But going way back to some of the early settlers, the early explorers, indigenous people, the relationship between indigenous people and slaves and all that. I'm just curious. And really, I guess the thing that hit me the most was who's telling the history. She talked about all these stereotypes to a certain extent, to a large extent, of Texas and Texans that come about because of who has written that history. And I thought that was an interesting way of describing all these interrelationships of these groups. And I just was wondering your thoughts as a Texan, as a professor and chair of history there at Del State on that kind of angle in this book.
Thank you. Yes, I actually own the book. I haven't had a chance to read it. I flipped through just a bit. I actually been trying to read in the last few days before we got to this meeting, but I just didn't have the time. But what I do want to talk about two of the things that you've mentioned. I think definitely Texas is stereotyped, and she talked about that a bit, about how Texas is a state of extremes. And I think we've seen that even just in the past year, looking at COVID, looking at what happened with electricity, both in the winter, and now they're having the same energy problems now in the summer. So they may lose massive amounts of, have massive blackouts again. And I think too, in terms of, fights over textbooks and all sorts of things. So Texas is often seen as a state of extremes. But within that, I think too, it's just not the negatives, but also positives. There's a slogan in Texas, everything is bigger in Texas. And so, they kind of love harder, they work harder, they, do the good harder, the bad harder. And so, the highways are bigger, the cars are bigger, the hair is bigger, everything is bigger in Texas. So both the good and the bad, if you will. But I think too, the issue that she brings about, I think kind of the experience of Texans and different people in the, in the state. So definitely Native Americans, different Native American groups. I have Native American Cherokees in my family, for instance, fairly close family. And so, but also I think in terms of people of different Hispanic backgrounds too. Parts of Texas were Mexico, and we have a lot of people from Mexico, a lot of people from Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and all of these places. And of course, white people and Asian people. But if you look at Texas, definitely in terms of demographics, the Hispanic population has been large forever. And in most cases, San Antonio, the predominant group, there are people mostly from Central America. Houston is, I'd say, I don't know the exact numbers now, but I think it's about 50% Hispanic. And so there is this kind of melting pot in ways that I think people don't always think about when they think about Texas.
Yeah, and the thing that strikes me is, as governor, is our obligation, and it really is why we have these forums, why we've decided to have these forums, and why the Heritage Commission is so important, is to make sure that people understand the breadth and depth of history from all the different points of view, not just from the white Anglo-Saxon, whatever kind of point of view, which a lot of the history comes from those writers. And you just look at this book itself, there is reference to slaves and to what were called free colors, reference the 1860 census here, but it doesn't get much into the lives of each of those groups, right? Unlike the Juneteenth book, which talks a lot about the interaction of the various subgroups. Really, really interesting, and I think goes to the purpose around the work of the Heritage Commission. And what we're trying to do here is to give Delawareans a fuller understanding of all the people and our history and heritage across the state. Dr. Hollingsworth, did you want to jump in next? And we again appreciate everything you do for our state, and we appreciate you being with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Governor Carney, and good evening, everybody. I appreciate this opportunity to share some bits of information about history in Delaware and across this nation. And I have chosen for my topic today the Emancipation Proclamation, the document that freed all slaves, but no slaves. In Paul's letter to the Galatians, he instructs the people to preserve their freedom. In chapter 5, verse 1, he says, "Freedom is what we have. Christ has set us free. So stand then as free people and do not allow yourselves to become slaves again." And verse 13 says, "As you, my brothers, you will be called free, but do not let freedom become an excuse for letting your physical desires control you. Instead, let love make you serve one another." But keep these scriptures in mind as we kind of talk about the Emancipation Proclamation and examine some of Abraham Lincoln's intentions for the Negro slaves as he crafted this document. In 1850, there were 33 states in the Union, but only 15 of those states, including Delaware, were slaveholding. The total number of slaves in the United States was 3,204,313, with the average value per slave at $300. Slaves were important to the economy of the country at the time because the slaves were the ones who produced the tobacco, the sugar, rice, hemp, and molasses. And many people believe that slavery existed only in the southern states, but we know that that's not true because slavery also existed here in the mid-Atlantic states. For instance, in Pennsylvania, the slaves were not freed by law until 1780. In New York, they were freed by law in 1799. In New Jersey in 1804. And in 1850, there were 19,000 free Blacks in the state of Delaware and 2,290 slaves and 809 slave owners in the state of Delaware. In Maryland, there were 75,000 free Blacks and 90,000 slaves. And Virginia had 54,000 free Blacks and 473,000 slaves. So slaveholding, as you see, and breeding of slaves was really quite popular in Maryland and Virginia in 1850, with 25,000 slaves that were sold down the river into the other 7 slave states. And in 1850, by revival of the slave traffic, the slave plantation and the population there had risen to more than 4 million. And this was the year that Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Shortly after Lincoln won the presidency, 11 slave states seceded to form the Confederate States of America. 4 states, the slave states there of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained in the Union. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln conceived a plan for emancipation of slaves through compensation of slave owners by the United States government. For instance, since Delaware was the smallest of the slaveholding states, and they had only 1,798 slaves at the time, he decided to submit a proposition first to the state of Delaware. And the proposition was that the government of the United States would pay the state of Delaware the sum of $900,000 in payments of $90 per year for 10 years. And this would be gradually emancipating the slaves year by year and extended over a period of 10 years. And the crux of the thing was that after the state was supposed to have received this money, they were then to pay the slave owners the value of those emancipated slaves. And this proposition actually passed the Delaware State Senate, but it did not pass the House. Now, there was much evidence that suggests that Mr. Lincoln's proclamation, which was issued September 22nd, 1862, to become effective January 1st, 1863, was a tactical move designed not to free the slaves, but to keep as many slaves as possible in slavery until he had gained support for his real plan. And Lincoln wanted first to free Negroes gradually and then ship them out of the country to Africa and South America, to deport them, to move a move there he called racial cleansing of the United States of America. A lot like Dr. Martin Luther King, Lincoln had a dream. And his dream was to have a lily white America without Negroes and without Native Americans. He tried to maneuver to fulfill his dream by ensuring that Negroes left America in a body as the Hebrew children had left Egypt. Abraham Lincoln, like many white people in the 1800s, was known to use the N-word at all times, both in public and in private. After his election as president, Lincoln was forced to deal with what was called the nigger question. President Lincoln and the Republican Party were unpopular in Delaware and were actually called nigger lovers. Mr. Lincoln, who was a poor white man actually, and was, because of the darkness of his skin, was charged with being confused about his own racial identity. He had Negro blood in his DNA. Great pressure was brought to bear upon President Lincoln to free slaves at the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, but he refused. He had steadfastly opposed the extension of slavery into new territory, but in his inaugural address, he had repeated his often made statement that he had no wish to interfere with slavery where it already existed. And Abe Lincoln wrote on August 20th, 1862, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing all slaves, I would do it." Okay. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. You see, his concern was to preserve the Union and to prevent the secession of the Southern states. President Lincoln proposed a constitutional amendment to emancipate slaves by the year 1900. He believed, until his death, that the Negro was the other, quote, the inferior, the subhuman, who he had said was a necessity, a subordinate, enslaved, quarantined to protect the sexual, social, political, and economic interests of white people. Everything Lincoln did was based on this racist idea. God knows that Lincoln did not want to issue an executive order to emancipate the slaves, but he had to face it. He could no longer dodge the issue. The state Republicans staged a revolt and threatened to bring his government down. So Lincoln realized that he was on the brink of destruction. He commented that it appears to me that the Almighty is against me and I can hardly see a ray of hope. In order to save the Union, Lincoln had only one option, and that was to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. He knew if he failed to issue the proclamation, there would be a rebellion in the North. And so Lincoln played politics with the Southern slave owners and made deals to exempt them from freeing slaves in areas which heavily depended on slavery. He shrewdly crafted the Emancipation Proclamation to reestablish slavery in favor of the Southern slave masters. In a word, he re-enslaved some 500,000 slaves. In his own words, Abe Lincoln said, the Emancipation Proclamation did not in and of itself and would not make a single Negro free beyond our military reach. And Lincoln broke faith with the slaves. Now the Bible speaks of the deceitful treatment of slaves. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 34, verses 8 through 22, King Zedekiah and the people of Jerusalem had made an agreement to set their Hebrew slaves free, and they never to enslave them again. But after the slaves were freed, King Zedekiah and the people changed their minds and freed or forced again the people into slavery. And the slaves were set free, were not set free, but eventually they were set free, never to be enslaved again. So I wonder if Abe Lincoln had this scripture in mind when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. This document made slavery legal and illegal at the same time. And as you read the Emancipation Proclamation, and part of it has been shared with you today, you will note that it is not a real Emancipation Proclamation and did not liberate slaves. The proclamation freed only the slaves in the territory still in rebellion. It did not apply to the 800,000 or more slaves in the 4 border states that had not joined the Confederacy. Nor did it apply to those states under Union control. Slavery in some slave states, which remained in the Union, and Delaware was one, was not abolished by the proclamation. Abe Lincoln had been enshrined as the great emancipator who freed the Negro slaves by a stroke of the pen. What a myth. Abe Lincoln was not the great emancipator. He did not emancipate slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation was a mirage, an illusion. What Lincoln did was, when he signed the document, was only to sign a promise of freedom. Now, how did the Black folks respond to all of this? Well, they waited all night and they prayed all night on December 31st, 1862, which was New Year's Eve, also known as Freedom's Eve. They waited for news that the Emancipation Proclamation had actually been signed. And when the news was received, they were jubilant. They were in prayers and shouts and joys of songs of joy that they sang, and the Black folks really fell on their knees and thanked God. It was only through suffering and the providence of God that the slaves were eventually set free. Now, how would you respond if you had been told that a jolly white man with a beard has signed a document ending your slavery and ensuring that you and your family will live in freedom like all other people with land and a decent house and a mule? Because of the criminal justice system, most Blacks could not read, and even those who could not understand immediately that the proclamation in and of itself did not free anybody on January 1st, 1863. The real day of deliverance was December 18th, 1865, the day the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution was ratified. But the state of Delaware refused to adopt and to ratify the 13th Amendment. And it did not do so until February 6, 1901. Delaware and Kentucky retained slavery after the amendment went into force. And I think people really need to commit these two sentences to memory, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. It is scandalous to me that Americans, both Black and white, are so totally misinformed about the emancipation of slaves in the United States. We celebrate Jubilee Day on the 1st of January each year, believing that Abraham Lincoln signed a document that freed the Negro slaves on January 1st, 1863. We celebrate Juneteenth Day on June 19th because we've been told that that was the day in 1865 that the slaves in remote areas of Texas heard the news that President Lincoln had freed the slaves. Black churches, not white churches, hold watch night services on New Year's Eve, which can be traced back to the gatherings of Negroes on December 31st, 1862, who anxiously awaited the news of the Emancipation Proclamation. We must never forget, nor forfeit, nor falsify our past. Freedom is not free, and the struggle for freedom continues. It was the period following the Civil War and the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, which had a great impact on Black people even today. Reconstruction, a period known as Redemption, which lasted for 12 years from 1865 to 1877, witnessed the election and or appointment of approximately 2,000 Black office holders from sheriffs to senators. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the Reconstruction Act of 1867 led to the whipping post, the branding iron, and the penal stocks being abolished, and Black men were given the right to vote. But little provisions were made to educate Blacks. Excuse me. Because the anti-lynching laws were seldom enforced, lynching and race riots continued for more than 60 years following the end of the Civil War. Black codes were enacted by Southern states to enforce segregation and to maintain economic and political domination by whites. Southern whites were so determined to maintain their way of life that they resorted to fraud, intimidation, and murder to reestablish control. The Ku Klux Klan and many other organizations were formed to terrorize, maim, and to kill large numbers of Negroes, and to enforce the Black codes and to keep Jim Crow alive. Police brutality, police harassment, unequal law enforcement, malicious prosecution, and mistreatment of juveniles all targeted Blacks and failed to protect them. The race problem is still unsolved. Negroes have made notable progress toward first-class citizenship in recent years, but there are so many inequalities that we still suffer, often based on the white man's ignorance and fear of Negro control. Most white people look upon us as inferior and second-class citizens, and they have declared the United States to be a white man's country. Even today, the federal, state, and local governments are reluctant to enact and enforce the rights of people of different race and culture. And following World War II, President Harry Truman appointed a committee of Blacks and whites to study the civil rights and make recommendations for the elimination of segregation based on race color, creed, or national origin, and the elimination of discrimination in higher education. He issued an order requiring fair employment, which opened the doors for increased employment opportunities for Blacks, leading to integration of public housing, public schools, parks, and hotels, etc. And numerous whites then fled to the suburbs, opened private and charter schools, and changed jobs and protested the mixing of races. A Mississippi senator who did not think the creator ever intended for Black and white races to live together on equal terms said so. White flight versus Black revolution together, sit-ins and marches and riots, white backlash, redlining, and following all of this followed the Civil Rights Acts of 1964. So what's next? What about our children? The schools have become resegregated in many instances, and there's a pipeline from school to prison for our Black children. What can we do to eliminate crime in our neighborhoods? The race climate today lets us know that we really cannot stop now. The stakes are too high. The challenge is ours, and the time is now. And we can do it. We are a designer model. We are designer originals. God has shaped each of us to be our own unique self. When our ancestors asked God why he was taking them through the troubled waters, his answer was because the enemies can't swim. It was nobody but God who has brought us this far.
I don't know whether we lost the connection there. Are you still there with us, Dr. Hollingsworth? Sil, why don't we move on to you? I think we've lost Dr. Hollingsworth's internet connection.
Okay, I would first like to start off and say, Governor, you asked me whether I wanted to go before or after Dr. Hollingsworth, after having given those incredible comments from Dr. Hollingsworth and that incredible history lesson and education. I probably would have felt more comfortable going before her rather than after her, but I will accept the challenge of trying to add what she just said. Dr. Patterson has already said that things are big in Texas, but Juneteenth is bigger than Texas now. Again, we're talking about the House has just passed a bill to make Juneteenth a national holiday. And so everyone in the country has to reconcile themselves to what does Juneteenth mean? It actually is beginning to change its name, which referred to as Freedom Day. It's referred to as African-American Independence Day, because we're looking for this celebration that says slavery is over and African-American citizens are now first-class citizens, which again is what the Dr. Hollingsworth was expressing in terms of the history that she gave, saying that we're not talking about an event that took place. We're talking about a process which is still going on in order for African Americans to achieve first-class citizenship. And so Juneteenth doesn't become something about Galveston, Texas. It doesn't become something about Texas. It becomes something about African American identity and the struggle which has taken place for 400 years and has taken place most recently in the civil rights movement and most recently in Black Lives Matter and in most instances in criminal justice reform. So Juneteenth has taken on a whole new meaning and gives us the opportunity to have these kinds of events where we can educate everyone as to the struggle which has gone on and the struggle that's continued. I would like to share with you the words of 3 African-American historical figures. The first one is Frederick Douglass. And one of the great speeches that Frederick Douglass gave was, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" And this is part of this conversation where the larger society, again, celebrates the 4th of July as Independence Day, as their freedom from the tyranny of a unjust ruler of Britain at the time. But in 1852, when Frederick Douglass gave his speech, slavery was still legal in the United States. And so he posed the question, what to the slave is the 4th of July? And I would like to share with you some of the words from his speech. Thurgood Marshall, Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, was invited to participate in the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution of the United States. Thurgood Marshall said, I'm not going to go. And they asked Thurgood Marshall, why don't you want to go? He said, the framers and the framers of this Constitution and the writers of this Constitution created an incomplete document. And so if I go and celebrate the signing of the Constitution, I am signing a flawed document which is still evolving, okay? And so Thurgood Marshall objected to celebrating the Constitution. And again, I would like to share his words with you because his words are more articulate than mine. And I would like him to speak for himself or speak through me in order to know what his objection was and how he saw the Constitution of the United States. In 1903, as part of Delaware history, we all remember one of the great stains on the state of Delaware, which is that George White, a man who was a true murderer, who, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, probably should have been lynched, but let me not say that. But we all have to abide by the rule of law. And so I have to say, as government says and the law says, he should have had the right to justice and a jury of his peers rather than being tied to a tree and set on fire. Paul Laurence Dunbar, okay, George White was tied to a tree and set on fire in June, and July 4th came up, and we celebrated the 4th of July. Paul Laurence Dunbar said, why are you celebrating? He asked the African-American community, why are you celebrating? 3,000 men just took a black man out of jail, tied him to a tree and celebrate and set him on fire, and you're having a barbecue and you're singing God Bless America and you're singing the Star-Spangled Banner. And so he questioned what was going on in America. And again, as Dr. Hollingsworth said, we have to, again, continue to go through life with our eyes open. And we have to celebrate those things we should be celebrating. And we have to challenge those things and protest those things which need to be protested against, okay, and probably don't need to be celebrated. We now have this Juneteenth opportunity, which we will get to, again, where we can say we are celebrating African-American independence. We are celebrating African-American Freedom Day. It is not an event. It is not something that took place in Texas. It is a continuum of African-Americans fighting for the right to equality in America. And that's a continuous process. Let me share with you the words of Frederick Douglass and the speech, which actually was a 2-hour speech, but I'm not going to take 2 hours of your time here. I'm just going to give you a paragraph of what to the slave is the 4th of July. What to the American slave is your 4th of July, I ask. A day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. You boasted liberty, an unholy license, your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty, heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, rash, fronted imprudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons, your thanksgiving, with all your religious parades and solemnity are to him more bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover your crimes, which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Frederick Douglass looked at the reality of slavery in America in 1852 and said, why is the slave, or why should I be celebrating the 4th of July? We go on again to talk about Thurgood Marshall. And these are incredible human beings. Thurgood Marshall, again, got Brown versus Board of Education. He was a Supreme Court justice for many years. Thurgood Marshall was a great American. And we thank Thurgood Marshall not only for his contribution to Black folks, but for his contribution to America. But Thurgood Marshall was asked to come to a celebration of the Constitution of the United States. And this is what he said: I cannot accept the invitation, for I do not believe that the meaning of the Constitution was forever fixed at the Philadelphia Convention. Nor do I find the wisdom and foresight and sense of justice exhibited by the framers particularly profound. To the contrary, the government they devised was defective from the start, requiring several amendments, a civil war, momentous social transformation to attain the system of constitutional government and its respect of the individual freedoms and human rights we hold as fundamental today. When contemporary Americans cite the Constitution, they evoke a concept that is vastly different from what the framers barely began to construct 2 centuries ago. This again is Thurgood Marshall challenging the framers of the Constitution to say, you had slavery in the Constitution. Women didn't have the right to vote in the Constitution. And so he again challenged the Constitution as it should be challenged, as a flawed document. We go on to Paul Laurence Dunbar, who was a great, great wordsmith, a great, great poet. And he put words into poetry that express things that are tough for us to come up with the words to express. There were lynchings going on all over the country. And one came here to Delaware. And even Delaware said, this ain't us. This lynching is not us. We are law-abiding citizens. Lynching is something that takes place in the South. Lynching is something that takes place with horse thieves down in Mississippi. This has got something to do with another part of the country. This has got nothing to do with Delaware. But somehow in Delaware, 3,000 folks broke into a jail, took a man out of jail, tied him to a tree, and set him on fire. And these are the words of Paul Laurence Dunbar on that event and other events which were taking place. Paul Laurence Dunbar said, every wire, no longer from the South alone, bring us news of a new hanging or a new burning, some recent outrage against a helpless people, some fresh degradation of an already degraded race. One man sins and a whole nation suffers. And still we celebrate. Like a dark cloud pregnant with terror and destruction, disenfranchisement has spread its wings over our brothers of the South. Like the same dark cloud, industrial prejudice glooms above us in the North. We may not work save when the newcomer come foreigners refuse to work, and then high prized above our sacrificial lives. Many shoot us down and with impunity, and yet we celebrate. With citizenship discredited and scorned, violated homes and long heated prayers, bleeding hands uplifted, still sore and smarting from long beating at the door of opportunity, we raise our voices and sing, "My country, 'tis of thee." We shout and sing, while from the 4 points of the compass comes our brother's unveiling cry. And still we celebrate. Juneteenth, as we make it this national holiday, has to take on a new meaning and does take on a new meaning of talking about the struggle for civil rights, the struggle for equality. We again say Juneteenth is not an event that took place in Texas, but again, it is the African-American sacrifice and the African-American struggle that someday we will say, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And you posed the question that I had written down earlier on, which we only have a couple minutes left, and I'd asked each of you, there are kind of two questions really, and you got to it very closely in terms of it being about the struggle, not so much the historical date, et cetera, but the question is, why should we celebrate Juneteenth and how should we celebrate a Juneteenth? If each of you could take a minute or two in the 5 or so minutes we have left, that would be a good way to sign off, I think. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Patterson, since Syl just went, and we'll go back the way we started.
Well, I think in terms of Juneteenth, for me, again, as someone who's been celebrating it all of my life, I think I will continue to celebrate it in that fashion. I think it is interesting to see how it is celebrated in different ways, in different parts of this country, in different parts of the world. My hope, though, is that the essence of Juneteenth remains, no matter how it is celebrated. And, you know, with it likely becoming a federal holiday, what will it morph into? Like, how far will it go? And so I think that remains to be seen.
And for you, the essence is?
I don't think it's something that I can easily capture quickly.
Great. Dr. Hollingsworth.
Well, I've had some questions about celebrating Juneteenth without educating people about the history that surrounds the need for a celebration and an understanding of Black people's trials and tribulations, in addition to the contributions that we and our ancestors have made toward the development of this country. So if we can somehow incorporate that as a part of our celebration, I would be more pleased than just having a day off to go to the beach or have a picnic in the backyard. I want us to really learn about the history of Black folks and all the terms we've been called over the times that we've been here, and understand that, you know, when we came here, we were not stupid. We were all intelligent people, had come from a continent, not a country. A lot of people don't even realize that Africa was a continent with 46 or 43 countries rather than they speak of it as a country. And so if we can somehow get people to understand what we are, who we are, where we came from, and why, I would be happy to celebrate Juneteenth.
Well, often on holidays, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, Martin Luther King's birthday. I hear the expression, it's a day, it should be a day, not just a day off, but a day on.
Mhm.
Still, you mentioned this, I think, in your remarks a couple times. Why and how should we commemorate, celebrate Juneteenth?
Well, I think one of the first steps is to add Black history contributions to the curriculum so that people understand why we're doing it. Because unless we make it really important that you learn our history, the celebration is going to be meaningless to so many people. And I just want the entire United States country to understand that we are here, why we're here, what we've contributed to this country, and why there is a need to celebrate our contributions to this country.
So HB 198,
I'm pleased with that, yes.
help there. So
I'm going to go in the other direction. My sons are down in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they have an event called Booze, Booze and Barbecues, and you know, I'm really for the picnic. So I might want to make it a family day, and I want to make it a celebration, and I want everyone to have a good time.
Well, thank you all for sharing your thoughts, sharing these historical facts and observations. This is our second year doing this. We've got others to come. You all know, particularly as members of the Heritage Commission, that there's been the discovery at the John Dickinson Plantation of the slave burial ground. We need to sort out how to handle that, how to handle the history around it, as sacred ground. And we expect that the Heritage Commission will help us with that. We look forward. We're going to have a forum on that, as well as the Supreme Court's 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case, which interestingly, Delaware's case was the only one affirmed by the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. We will sign that bill, HB 198, tomorrow. I think I was saying Saturday, just to get that date straight. Again, thank you for joining us. Those of you who've tuned in, we appreciate you joining us as well. And whether you commemorate Juneteenth with a big barbecue and tunes and everything, or whether you do it by reading this On Juneteenth book, which I would once again recommend, as well as Delaware During the Civil War, which goes to the information that you shared, Dr. Hollingsworth, about Congressman Fisher and the president trying to get together to pay the state to purchase the slaves' freedom from slaveholders that fell apart after passing one house of the General Assembly, and some of the other information. Really fascinating and interesting for all of us. So thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in the other forums of the Delaware Heritage Commission.